23 feet beneath the Egyptian desert, a team of archaeologists broke through into a limestone burial chamber that had been sealed for 36 centuries and found exactly what you'd expect from the tomb of a king. Painted goddesses guarding the entrance, soaring mud brick vaults, a chamber built on a scale reserved only for royalty. And then they looked for the one thing that should have been the easiest part of the whole discovery. His name. It wasn't there. Ancient robbers had gotten to it first, thousands of years ago, and damaged the exact spot where the king's identity was written, thoroughly enough that today, with all of modern archaeology's tools, nobody on Earth can tell you who this man actually was. This is a true story. It happened recently, and it's exactly as strange as it sounds, and by the time you understand why the gap in the record matters so much, you'll see this as far more than a simple case of bad luck. Let's start with where this tomb actually is, because the location itself carries enormous weight in ancient Egyptian history and shapes everything about how seriously archaeologists take this specific find. The discovery was made at Abydos in Upper Egypt, roughly 6 miles from the Nile River. Abydos isn't just another ancient site among thousands scattered across Egypt. For most of Egyptian history, it was considered one of the most sacred cities in the entire civilization, believed by the ancient Egyptians themselves to be the burial place of Osiris, the god of the afterlife, and functioning as a royal necropolis, a dedicated resting ground for kings, going back to the very earliest dynasties of Egyptian history, long before the pyramids at Giza were ever conceived. Being buried at Abydos wasn't a random choice for a pharaoh, and it wasn't cheap or easy to arrange either. It meant something specific and deliberate. It placed a ruler's eternal resting place at the symbolic heart of Egyptian religious cosmology, in the company of history's very first kings, and it signaled to anyone who understood Egyptian religious geography that the person buried there considered themselves a legitimate part of that unbroken royal tradition, regardless of how much of the country they actually controlled while alive. The team responsible for this discovery was a joint Egyptian-American mission led by Dr. Joseph Wegener, an Egyptologist and curator at the University of Pennsylvania's Penn Museum, working in close cooperation with Egypt's Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities. This wasn't a first attempt at Abydos for Wegener either. He has spent years, in some cases decades, working this specific stretch of desert, patiently mapping, excavating, and re-excavating a necropolis that has already given up secrets before and clearly still had more to offer. This find wasn't even his first major royal discovery here. Back in 2014, his team uncovered the tomb of a previously completely unknown pharaoh named Senebkay, a name that had never once appeared in any surviving Egyptian king list, historical record, or inscription anywhere else before that dig. That 2014 discovery matters enormously to this story, because it's what set the stage for everything that followed, and it's the reason this new, nameless tomb didn't just get filed away as an isolated curiosity. The moment its identifying inscriptions turned out to be damaged beyond recovery. The tomb itself was found during fieldwork conducted in December and January, buried nearly 23 feet under the sand at the ancient necropolis known as Anubis Mountain, part of the broader Abydos site. What the team uncovered was genuinely impressive in scale, especially once you consider how much labor and organization it would have required from a kingdom that, as we'll get to shortly, didn't actually control very much territory at all. A limestone burial chamber, its entryway decorated with painted scenes depicting the sister goddesses Isis and Nephthys, two of the most important funerary deities in Egyptian religion, typically shown flanking and protecting the dead on their journey into the afterlife. Behind that entrance sat a series of connected rooms, capped by mud brick vaults soaring some 16 feet high, an architectural undertaking that would have required serious labor, serious planning, and serious royal resources to construct in the first place. Resources that had to be extracted from a comparatively small, contested slice of southern Egyptian territory. Wegener himself has described the moment of discovery in strikingly honest terms, saying simply that his team came upon a royal tomb they had no idea existed at all. That's worth sitting with for a second, because it tells you something important about how archaeology at a site like Abydos actually works, even in the 21st century, with satellite imaging, ground-penetrating radar, and more than 100 years of accumulated survey data already on file. Even after all of that, even at one of the most intensively studied ancient sites on Earth, the ground can still, without warning, produce something nobody had any indication was there, buried just deep enough and just quietly enough to avoid every previous survey. Here's where the story stops being a straightforward, triumphant discovery and turns into a genuine historical puzzle, one that has left professional Egyptologists themselves publicly acknowledging they simply don't have an answer yet. When Wegener's team reached the section of the tomb where the king's name should have been recorded in hieroglyphic text painted onto plastered brickwork flanking the burial chamber's entrance, they found that ancient tomb robbers had already been there long before them and had damaged that exact section of the tomb badly enough that the name itself simply doesn't survive in any legible form. Wegener has been direct about this in interviews since the announcement, explaining plainly that there were no human remains left in the chamber at all, no funerary equipment, no sarcophagus fragments, nothing physically connecting a specific individual to this specific burial beyond the architecture itself. The tomb had been thoroughly plundered in antiquity, and whoever did the plundering, whether deliberately targeting the identifying inscriptions in some kind of act of erasure, or simply causing collateral damage while ripping through the space looking for gold, jewelry, and anything else of immediate material value, left behind a tomb that is unmistakably architecturally royal and completely, frustratingly anonymous. So why does this specific gap matter so much to historians, rather than just being written off as one more unlucky loss to ancient looting? The kind of thing that has happened to countless tombs across Egypt over thousands of years? The answer connects directly back to that 2014 Senebkay discovery. And to understand it properly, you need to understand the specific slice of Egyptian history this tomb comes from, because this wasn't ancient Egypt at its familiar, unified, pyramid-building peak. The burial dates to what Egyptologists call the Second Intermediate Period, spanning roughly from 1640 to 1540 BCE, a genuinely chaotic, fragmented chapter sitting between two of Egypt's more famous, more unified eras, the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom. During this period, Egypt wasn't one unified nation under a single pharaoh at all. It was fractured into as many as 4 separate rival kingdoms operating simultaneously, each claiming its own share of legitimacy, its own royal titles, and, in some cases, its own competing burial traditions. In the north, the Hyksos, a dynasty of foreign rulers originally from West Asia, controlled the Nile Delta region and its crucial ports, effectively cutting Upper Egypt off from Mediterranean trade routes it had relied on for centuries. In the south, competing Egyptian ruling families, including the specific royal line based around Abydos itself, held their own separate territory, asserting their own independent claims to kingship, even while the wider country remained split, each side presumably viewing itself as the true continuation of Egyptian royal legitimacy. That specific southern ruling line, centered at Abydos, is what modern scholars have come to call the Abydos Dynasty. And here's the detail that makes the whole situation genuinely fascinating, rather than just another obscure historical footnote buried in a specialist journal somewhere. For a very long time, this dynasty's actual existence was seriously debated among historians, not casually dismissed, but genuinely argued over in academic literature. It appears, at best, faintly and incompletely in the surviving ancient king lists that Egyptian priests and scribes later compiled to record their nation's history, lists that were themselves often compiled generations or centuries after the fact, shaped by whichever dynasty happened to be in power at the time of compiling. Some scholars doubted whether a genuinely separate, independent Abydos-based dynasty had ever really existed at all, as opposed to being some kind of confusion, duplication, or scribal error in the historical record. Names accidentally repeated or misattributed across different regional lists compiled centuries apart. Wegener's 2014 discovery of Senebkay's tomb changed that debate significantly, providing the first solid, physical, archaeological proof that this dynasty was real, that actual kings had ruled from Abydos during this fractured period, been buried there according to proper royal funerary custom, and simply never made it into the more complete historical record that later generations of Egyptians and later generations of modern historians relied on to reconstruct the broader shape of this era. This new tomb, found this most recent excavation season, adds directly to that same small, precious body of physical evidence, evidence that exists almost entirely independent of written history, because written history mostly forgot this dynasty existed at all, leaving archaeology as the only reliable witness left. The tomb's specific architecture actually offers scholars a meaningful clue, even without a name attached to it. And this is where careful archaeological comparison starts to do real investigative work. According to statements from Mohammed Abdelbadi, head of the Egyptian Antiquities sector at the Supreme Council of Antiquities, the decorative style found in this newly discovered tomb closely resembles the style found in Senebkay's tomb from 2014, sharing enough specific artistic and architectural conventions that the connection between the two burials seems unlikely to be coincidental. This new tomb is also notably larger in scale than other tombs firmly attributed to the Abydos dynasty, a detail that carries its own implications, since tomb size in ancient Egypt generally tracked reasonably closely with the resources and authority a given king could actually command during his reign. That combination of stylistic similarity and larger scale has led some researchers to propose that this unnamed king may actually have reigned before Senebkay, functioning as an earlier link in this same forgotten royal lineage, possibly even a direct predecessor whose reign helped establish the traditions Senebkay's own burial would later follow, though that remains a working hypothesis rather than a settled conclusion at this stage. The tomb sits within a larger complex, originally built for an earlier, considerably more powerful pharaoh named Neferhotep, and its position within that broader necropolis layout gives archaeologists additional physical context for trying to work out roughly where in the dynasty's sequence this particular king might fit, even without his name to anchor that placement directly in any absolute chronological sense. It's worth pausing here to appreciate exactly how unusual this situation actually is within Egyptology as a field, because most people's mental image of Egyptian archaeology runs in the opposite direction entirely, shaped almost entirely by one specific atypical case. The most famous Egyptian discoveries in popular memory, Tutankhamun above all, are famous specifically because we know exactly who they were, complete with names, titles, family relationships, and reasonably well-documented reigns, cross-referenced against multiple independent sources. This tomb inverts that entire familiar formula. Here, researchers have unambiguous, undeniable physical proof, a genuine royal burial chamber aligned with royal architectural conventions, sitting in a royal necropolis, dated with reasonable confidence to a specific, roughly 100-year window based on stratigraphy and comparative style, and absolutely no way, at least for now, to attach a name to the man who was actually buried there. Anna Latifa Murad-Cizek, an archaeologist at the University of Chicago who wasn't involved in the excavation but has studied this general period extensively, described the discovery as highly significant specifically because it adds meaningfully to what she called a very limited body of evidence concerning the rulers of this particular region during this particular era. In a period of Egyptian history already defined by fragmentary, incomplete written records, spotty king lists, and rival dynasties that rarely bothered documenting each other's existence, every single additional physical tomb, named or not, meaningfully expands what historians actually have to work with when trying to reconstruct this chapter of the past. There's a broader pattern worth drawing out here too, because this discovery didn't happen in isolation. And understanding that wider context helps explain why Egyptologists are treating even an unnamed tomb as genuinely significant news rather than a disappointing dead end. It's part of a genuinely active, ongoing wave of significant tomb discoveries across Egypt in recent years, several of which involve exactly this same tension between physical discovery and historical identification playing out in different, sometimes contrasting ways. Around the same general period, a separate joint Egyptian-British archaeological mission announced the discovery of the tomb of King Thutmose II, notable specifically because it represented the first newly identified royal Egyptian tomb found since Tutankhamun's tomb was famously discovered back in 1922. So a gap of more than a century between major, definitively identified royal tomb discoveries. That tomb, though badly damaged by ancient flooding that occurred shortly after the king's death, forcing an extensive restoration effort just to stabilize what remained, was conclusively identified through inscriptions bearing Thutmose II's own name found on fragments of alabaster jars, alongside inscriptions naming his chief royal consort, who would later become one of history's most famous female rulers, Queen Hatshepsut. The contrast between that discovery, definitively named through surviving inscriptions despite serious physical damage to the tomb itself, and the Abydos tomb, architecturally royal but permanently anonymous despite comparatively better physical preservation, illustrates just how much ancient Egyptian archaeology still genuinely depends on a combination of luck and preservation, not simply on the skill or diligence of the excavation team involved, no matter how experienced or well-funded that team happens to be. It's also worth being precise and honest about exactly what remains uncertain here, because responsible treatment of an active archaeological mystery means resisting the urge to manufacture false certainty where none currently exists, however tempting a tidy answer might be for the sake of a clean narrative. Wegner's team, along with Egyptian antiquities officials, has proposed several candidate names drawn from the broader historical record of this period. Individuals like kings referred to in surviving fragments as Sennaib and Panjeni, rulers known to have dedicated monuments at Abydos during roughly this window of time, but whose own actual burial locations have never been identified anywhere in the archaeological record until now. It's entirely possible, even reasonably likely given the circumstantial evidence, that this newly found tomb belongs to one of these previously known but never located names, finally giving a physical resting place to a name that has existed only on monument inscriptions for 36 centuries. It's equally possible that it belongs to someone whose name doesn't survive anywhere in the historical record at all, a king known to history, if he becomes known at all, purely through this single physical structure, rather than through any surviving written reference to his reign ever being found again. This is where the story earns the description of a genuine, still open mystery rather than simply a discovery awaiting a formal announcement of its answer somewhere down the line. Ongoing research continues at the site, including further excavation work in the surrounding necropolis, continued study of the tomb's construction techniques and decorative program, and comparative analysis against other tombs from the same broader dynasty, all in the hope of eventually narrowing down the range of possibilities through indirect evidence, even if the direct evidence never resurfaces. But as of right now, the honest, accurate answer to the question of exactly who was buried in this tomb is that nobody knows. And there's a real, genuine possibility that nobody ever will, unless some future discovery elsewhere. A fragment of inscription, a reference in some other better preserved document sitting unread in a museum archive somewhere, happens to fill in the specific gap that ancient looters left behind when they damaged this tomb's entrance all those centuries ago. Consider, for a moment, the layered nature of loss this discovery actually represents, because it's more complicated than a single missing detail, and it's worth taking seriously as a genuine historical tragedy rather than just an academic inconvenience. This wasn't simply a case of an object going missing, a piece of jewelry or a ceremonial object that fell out of the historical record through ordinary decay or misplacement over the centuries. This was the deliberate or incidental erasure of a specific human being's identity. A king who once commanded enough resources, enough labor, and enough authority to have an entire limestone burial chamber built for himself, 16-foot vaults included, painted goddesses guarding his entrance, and who nonetheless ended up, through a combination of political fragmentation during his own lifetime and looting sometime in the centuries that followed his death, as close to completely forgotten as any ruler in Egyptian history can be, while still leaving behind unmistakable, undeniable physical proof that he actually existed and actually ruled over something, however contested or reduced that territory may have been. There's something genuinely worth sitting with in that specific combination of facts, because it cuts directly against how most people instinctively think about ancient rulers and historical memory, an assumption most of us carry around without ever really examining it. We tend to assume that kings, by definition, get remembered, that the entire point of building monuments, inscribing names, and constructing elaborate tombs is to guarantee a kind of permanence that ordinary people never get to claim for themselves. This discovery quietly demonstrates that even that assumption has real limits, limits that no amount of stone, labor, or royal authority could fully guarantee against. A man who was, by any reasonable definition, once one of the most powerful individuals in his corner of Egypt, commanding the labor and resources necessary to build a genuinely impressive royal tomb during a period when resources themselves were scarce and contested, can still, through nothing more than a few unlucky centuries, and the actions of robbers who likely never gave a second thought to the historical consequences of their looting, end up as anonymous to us today as any unmarked grave in any forgotten corner of the world. Step back and look at the complete shape of what this discovery actually represents, because it holds together as a genuinely significant piece of modern archaeology without needing a single invented detail layered onto it to make it compelling. A team of Egyptian and American archaeologists working at one of ancient Egypt's most sacred and historically significant sites uncovered a genuine royal tomb dating to one of the most poorly documented, most politically fragmented periods in the entire span of ancient Egyptian history, a period most casual students of Egypt have likely never even heard of. The tomb's scale, its decorative program, and its architectural style all confirm, beyond any reasonable doubt, that a real king was once buried there, with real resources and real ceremonial importance attached to his burial. And the specific damage inflicted by ancient tomb robbers, whether deliberate or simply incidental to their search for valuables, permanently erased the one detail that would have definitively closed this case. His name, the single piece of information that separates a solved historical mystery from an open one. That leaves modern historians in the genuinely unusual position of having conclusively proven that an entire, previously unrecognized branch of Egyptian royal history is real and physically verifiable, while remaining completely unable to say with certainty who, specifically, this newest physical proof actually belonged to, or where exactly he fits within the dynasty his own tomb just helped confirm existed. Every individual piece of this holds up under real scrutiny, which is precisely what makes it worth taking seriously rather than dismissing as archaeological speculation. The dating to the Second Intermediate Period rests on well-established archaeological and stylistic analysis, cross-checked against comparable material from other confirmed sites, not speculation built on a single ambiguous artifact. The connection to the broader Abydos Dynasty rests directly on physical comparison with Senebkay's independently confirmed 2014 tomb, a genuine point of comparison rather than a convenient assumption. The absence of the king's name is a directly documented, physically observed gap in the archaeological record, confirmed by the excavation team on site, not an assumption or a narrative device inserted for dramatic effect. But taken together, this discovery amounts to something genuinely rare in modern archaeology. Concrete, physical proof of a forgotten king's existence, arriving without the one piece of information that would let us actually call him anything at all, a monument to a man whose name outlived neither the looters who erased it, nor, so far, the archaeologists trying to recover it. There's one more layer to this story worth adding before closing, because it speaks to just how quickly the field of Egyptian tomb discovery has been moving in recent years, and why this particular gap in the record feels especially frustrating set against that backdrop. In the same broad window of time surrounding this Abydos find, Egypt has also seen the identification of a tomb linked to elite military figures from the era of Ramesses III, complete with a gold ring bearing the king's own name, bronze arrowheads in an ivory box, objects specific enough to anchor that particular burial firmly in the historical record without any ambiguity at all. Elsewhere, ongoing survey work using ground-penetrating radar near the Giza Pyramid Complex has sparked its own separate, heated debate among Egyptologists over claims of a possible underground network beneath the plateau, a controversy that remains unresolved and contested within the field, illustrating that modern Egyptology is very much still an active, argumentative, evolving discipline rather than a settled catalog of already known facts. Set against that backdrop, the unnamed Abydos tomb isn't an isolated oddity. It's one especially clear example of a much larger truth about the field right now. New tools, deeper excavation, and renewed international cooperation are producing genuine breakthroughs at a pace unseen in decades. And yet, even with all of that momentum, some of the most basic questions ancient Egypt can ask of us, simply who was this person, still don't always have answers waiting on the other side of the dig. It's also worth noting how the wider public reacted once this discovery went out through international media, because that reaction itself tells you something about why this particular gap resonates with people well beyond the small community of professional Egyptologists who actually study this period for a living. Coverage of the find spread quickly through major outlets, including Reuters, National Geographic, and multiple national newspapers across several countries, and much of that coverage leaned specifically into the unanswered question at the center of it, treating the missing name not as a disappointing footnote, but as the actual headline. That instinct makes sense. A tomb with a confirmed name slots neatly into an existing historical framework. One more entry in an already long list of known pharaohs. A tomb without one does something different. It leaves a door open, and it invites exactly the kind of ongoing public curiosity that keeps people checking back on a story for updates months and years later, waiting to hear whether some future excavation season finally closes the gap. If this made you think differently about how much of ancient history still depends on pure chance, on which specific inscriptions happen to survive looting, whether in the passage of 36 centuries fully intact, and which ones simply didn't make it, that's exactly the kind of discovery worth sitting with for a while, rather than filing away as one more entry in a long list of ancient tombs. Somewhere beneath the sand at Abydos, a king who once commanded enough power to be buried in a chamber built to last forever is still, for now, waiting for archaeology to finally give him back his name. And there's no guarantee that day will ever actually come.